Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to start in just a minute here. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Michelle Gaither, and on behalf of the Pacific Northwest Pollution Prevention Resource Center, I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's webinar discussing some of our issues, regulations, current technologies, best practices, and more for refrigerant use in the food retail sector. So the HFC refrigerants that we're going to be addressing today, for the most part, are commonly used refrigerants that have been the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And these leaky HFC systems not only release the greenhouse gases with very high global warming potential, they release to the atmosphere, but they are also costly to companies, and especially when they have to recharge after leakage. Additionally, these refrigerants are subject to more and more regulations, making compliance very rigorous. So with respect to the greenhouse gas emissions drawdown, a project and a book by Paul Hawken, next slide please, that educates about global warming and provides about 100 solutions to reverse the course of global warming, says that the #1 opportunity in their overall ranking system is refrigerant management. So I wanted to just briefly flash this screenshot of one of their web pages showing this, and you can just go to drawdown.org if you want to look further into that information. Let's go to the next slide for our quick agenda. Whoops, sorry. Okay, there we go, thank you. So please note that at any time you can use the hand button to pose questions, and we will hope to be able to answer all of them in the final Q&A session of the webinar. And so here is our agenda. We're going to introduce the topic and speakers, which I'm doing right now. Then we're going to hear about the North American Sustainable Refrigeration Council. Then we're going to hear about a really wealth of information about refrigerants in the food retail sector, issues, compliance and regulations, tools and technology, and leak prevention and best practices for that area. And then we're going to hear from Ben Jarvis with a quick story of a successful workshop on natural refrigerants that he held in Boise, Idaho, in case other people are interested in doing and conducting a similar workshop. Okay, back to the speaker pictures and bios, please. There we go. So I'm very excited for all of us to learn from our speakers about the challenges and opportunities for refrigerant management and best practices within the food retail sector. I will briefly introduce each of them now. I'm not going to read their entire bio to you, however. So our first speaker will be Morgan Smith, Project Manager, North American Sustainable Refrigeration Council. She has a background in sustainability and communications and manages their return on investment progress group and contractors and service technicians progress group, along with marketing, communication, and events for the organization. Among other degrees, Morgan holds an MS in environmental education. Our second speaker is Keely Whitman. She's the owner and founder of KW Refrigerant Management Strategy, a consulting firm that helps the supermarket industry manage the many strategic challenges of refrigeration. Prior to starting her own firm, she single-handedly ran the EPA's Green Shell Partnership, which grew to encompass over 8,500 supermarkets nationally. She's presented and written many articles on the topic, co-authored best practice guidelines and tools, and you will see a list of some of these and get links to them as we go through the presentation. And in 2010, she was named one of the industry's 50 most influential people by Supermarket News. She has a law degree and MS in environmental policy. And then our final speaker is Ben Jarvis, who has headed Idaho's pollution prevention program since 2011. He collaborates with a lot of regional and national partners on reducing pollution in a variety of industries. A recent project let Ben undertake an auditing and impact analysis of refrigerant use in commercial settings, including at Boise State's climate impact from refrigeration leaks in HVAC and their cold storage applications. And this work was recently complemented by a joint effort with NASRC to put on the workshop I just mentioned. And Ben has a BA in economics and history. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Morgan Smith. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, I am a project manager with the North American Sustainable Refrigeration Council. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization who is spearheading efforts to overcome the barriers that are slowing the widespread adoption of natural refrigerants. I'll talk about that more in just a second, but first I'm going to take a step back here. Michelle mentioned that HFCs, which are the most commonly used refrigerants today, have been named the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. We measure the climate impact of these refrigerants through something called global warming potential, or GWP. Many of you may be familiar with this. And this is really a relative measure of the amount of heat that's trapped in the atmosphere compared to CO2. So that's where you end up with global warming potential. So you'll see over on the left of this graph, CO2 has a GWP of 1, and then you'll see the circled refrigerants over on the right. These HFC refrigerants are off the charts compared to that, which is why we would consider them these super greenhouse gases and why we're talking about this in the first place. Furthermore, if you look at HFC emissions by sector, refrigeration is one of the biggest contributors to HFC emissions. And then if you look even closer at refrigeration in general, supermarkets are one of the biggest contributors to these emissions within refrigeration, which you'll hear a lot about from Keely in a few minutes here. And if you look at this even closer and you take the leakage of an average supermarket, which comes in at about 25% for each store. And if you find the average, it's somewhere around 1,000 pounds of refrigerant that's leaked each year. If you multiply this by the roughly 38,000 supermarkets in the US and the 4,000 GWP of a very common HFC refrigerant, R404A, we get about 152 billion pounds of CO2 equivalent released into the atmosphere every year. So this is a huge number, and this is why this is a big topic and we're talking about it. That's roughly equivalent to nearly 13 million passenger vehicles driven for 1 year. You can see these other equivalencies in these bottom images. So what are some alternatives to overcome this challenge? Well, one great alternative is natural refrigerants, including carbon dioxide, ammonia, and hydrocarbons. So what are natural refrigerants? Well, they're naturally occurring, they cannot be patented, and they have a negligible impact on the climate. You can see what I mean by a negligible impact on the climate if you look at this graph. So over on the left, you can see ammonia, CO2, and propane have very, very, very low to zero GWP compared to some of these HFC refrigerants that you see over on the right. On this graph, there's a significant difference here in the global warming potential of natural refrigerants versus HFC refrigerants. To look even deeper, natural refrigerants, in addition to the reduced emissions that they bring, they also offer regulatory compliance for supermarkets, which you'll hear about, given the fact that the climate impact of these refrigerants are causing a lot of regulations and policies to go into place. So supermarkets who adopt natural refrigerants don't need to face those anymore, which offers a lot of flexibility in the future, not having to worry about future phase outs and phase downs. And then in addition to that, there are potential energy savings, which lead to a lower total cost of ownership. That's what that TCO is overall for these refrigeration systems. So with so many great benefits, why wouldn't a supermarket or grocery store want to adopt natural refrigerants? Well, unfortunately, we still face a lot of challenges, such as high upfront costs, slow revision and out-of-date codes and standards, and service readiness. I'll mention that all of these costs are all of these challenges are sort of interrelated. For example, one challenge associated with service readiness is the availability of contractors who have been trained in natural refrigerants. So typically, we often see service contractors who don't necessarily want to be trained in a system if they don't have one to work on, understandably, which drives up the cost of service for supermarkets if they want to adopt natural refrigerant systems. So all of these challenges are actually why the NASRC was born. So a couple of years ago, our founder, Keely Whitman, she may not like me for calling her out right now, but she came together and really realized that there was this need to address the barriers that are preventing the adoption of natural refrigerants and give them an equal spot on the market. And so she brought together stakeholders from the commercial refrigeration industry, including Whole Foods and Target and several other key stakeholders, and the NASRC was born. And we really exist to take action and address these barriers head on so that natural refrigerants are an easier choice if they're the right choice for a supermarket or grocery store. And we do this through what we call progress groups, which are composed of our members who are commercial refrigeration stakeholders who are in the field experiencing these challenges and benefits on a daily basis. So they bring their expertise and their insights to us, and we turn that into actionable solutions for each of our progress groups. And each progress group addresses a different issue area that we find crucial to the adoption of natural refrigerants. So I'll give you a quick example here. Our contractors and service technicians progress group is contributing to the barrier of service readiness. And a few of the things that we do in that group are contribute to the development of or promote existing natural refrigerant training, connect end users, and we refer to supermarkets and grocery stores, anyone who is the end user of a refrigerant as end users, connect end users who are interested with natural refrigerants with contractors and service technicians who have been trained in natural refrigerants, and contribute to the development of natural refrigerant service standards. So we do a variety of activities like this in each of our progress groups. And just to give you an idea of the breadth of stakeholders who are participating in these groups, this is just a snapshot of our many, many members that are involved in these initiatives. And these range from grocery stores to consulting firms to engineering firms to manufacturers. Anybody who has a stake in the commercial refrigeration industry has a place in our organization and has expertise to share. And they benefit from being connected to this network of other stakeholders. So for the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to Keely, but my contact information is at the end of this presentation. Absolutely feel free to reach out to me if you want to get involved or have any questions about some of the activities we're working on. So Keely, I will turn it over to you now.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Morgan. I've been asked today to focus in on refrigerant regulations and compliance. I know that many of the attendees on this webinar are out there in the field trying to help different types of businesses comply with regulations and also just go beyond compliance. So I'm responsible for that section of the webinar. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as you can imagine, there is an awful lot to talk about related to refrigerant regulations. There is a whole section of the Clean Air Act that deals with ozone depleting substances and which refrigerants are. It's Title VI of the Clean Air Act. So that is a federal regulatory schema. It's not like much of the other parts of the Clean Air Act, which are actually delegated to the states. The refrigerant regulations are all federal, and they are enforced by the regional offices of the EPA. However, states can legislate and regulate under their own laws, which California did. California has the Refrigerant Management Program regulatory schema, and that resulted from legislation in California that set goals to reduce greenhouse gases by specific amounts in 2030 and 2050. And therefore, they asked CARB to develop regulations. CARB did a similar analysis to what Ben had just talked about. They went out and looked at the various sources of greenhouse gas emissions and very quickly realized, wow, the HFC emissions are the low-hanging fruit of the climate change world. And frankly, within the area of HFC emissions, the best bang for their buck in terms of making improvements is with supermarkets, both because they use so much refrigerant, but also because they leak so much refrigerant. So that's how California's refrigerant management program came about. It's a fairly rigorous program, and I know a lot of businesses, a lot of supermarkets and other types of food retailers in California really struggle with it. So far, they are the only state that has some kind of regulatory system. However, just about a month and a half ago, 17 additional states issued a press release saying that they plan to regulate high GWP refrigerants. So it's going to be very interesting to see what these states do. And that is a direct response to the federal government's pulling back on regulations related to climate change. So there's a group of states in the country that basically said, well, if the federal government isn't going to address this, then we have to step in. So we are likely to see something coming from these additional states shortly in the future. One thing to mention about these refrigerant regulations, regardless of whether federal or the state of California, is that the vast majority of the compliance responsibility and almost the entire liability for compliance is on the end user. And Morgan explained what we mean by end user. It's a term of art. Because we have so many different types of stakeholders in the supermarket industry, service techs obviously have a huge effect on how well you comply or not, but it's actually the end user of the refrigerant, the owner operator of the refrigerant equipment, that bears the responsibility and the liability. So we refer to them as the end user. Next slide, please. So just very briefly here, so Title VI of the Clean Air Act, it's not just refrigeration and air conditioning. It's all kinds of really strange things. You know, some food products that are brought in from overseas get put into humongous fumigation warehouses, and they are bombed with methyl bromide. Methyl bromide actually is covered under Title VI of the Clean Air Act. Asthma inhalers, all kinds of strange stuff. We are going to focus in on refrigeration and air conditioning. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. There we go. Okay, within refrigeration and air conditioning, there are a whole bunch of different industries that are affected. And I'm not going to read all of these out to you, but anyone that you run into out there in the field, I'm going to refer specifically to food retailers. Sometimes I will just refer without thinking about it to supermarkets, but what I mean is all food retailers, including convenience stores, these little gas station stores, your mom and pop stores, but also don't forget that most food retailers have some kind of a distribution center somewhere that is refrigerated. There are industrial process facilities that use a lot of refrigeration. You can imagine the people that manufacture ice cream. They use an enormous amount of refrigerant. So if you run into anybody out there that does any of these things on this list, they are going to fall under the refrigeration and air conditioning regulations within Title VI. Cool. So next slide, please. So the refrigeration regulations, if you look at the text of them, they actually seem very, very easy. They seem very straightforward. However, there are multiple layers. There are multiple amendments that have happened since the original regulations. And I don't know why government does this, but every time that they publish an amendment, they focus only on what has changed. And sometimes it's very difficult to just find the entire list of compliance responsibilities in one place. There are constant ongoing legal battles. And frankly, this all results in just complete confusion within the regulated community. This is meant a little bit to be funny, but I'd actually be happy if we had complete confusion out there, because that would at least mean that everyone that is regulated by this knew that they were regulated by this. The people that are out there running around in ignorant bliss, that's only because they don't even know that they have to follow these regulations. So all of those industries within refrigeration and air conditioning that were on the previous slide, it's the same regulations that apply to all. There are some slight variances, but a convenience store follows the same regulations as a supermarket and as a wholesale distribution center. Next slide, please. So this is what I call the Section 608 compliance wheel. And all of these parts of the wheel, they are all parts of the Section 608 regulations. The ones that the majority of people that you speak with will be concerned about is the service practices, the repairing refrigerant leaks, and both of those, in fact, boil down to record keeping. So Section 608 is a record keeping regulation. It's very, very hard to catch someone deliberately leaking refrigerant out in the field. You basically have to stand there with a video camera and watch them venting refrigerant. And even then, you can't actually see refrigerant. So how they get everybody is through the record keeping. There are a lot of records that you must keep, and you must keep them for 3 years, and you must be able to make them available to an inspector if an inspector comes and visits a store. So in the end, it all boils down to record keeping. Next slide, please. So why is this such a big deal? The reason this is such a big deal is that there are very, very heavy fines associated with this. So the fine for any violation of Section 608 is $37,500 per violation per day. So let's say you forgot to keep a record for an entire year. Multiply $37,500 times 365, and you see how big the fines can get very, very quickly. So for the most part, the EPA goes after fairly large supermarket chains, and they try to go after national chains. But that does not mean that they don't enforce against some of the smaller people out there. That doesn't get as much press, but they are obligated to investigate anyone that they receive a tip about. And the way that the majority of tips come into them is through disgruntled employees or service contractors that were fired from a contract, and they will then make an anonymous tip. And no matter how small you are, everybody probably has a few disgruntled employees out there, all it takes is for that employee to give a tip to the EPA, and then you are the subject of an inspection. So next slide, please. So a little bit about refrigerants and technology. Next slide. This is for the people who want to go beyond compliance. So in terms of where the problem lies here, there are kind of two philosophies. Is the problem the refrigerant? So is it, if the refrigerant were environmentally benign, you could leak as much as you want and it wouldn't harm the environment. So a lot of people out there say the solution to this is to use an environmentally benign refrigerant. And then and those would be, as close as we can get to those, are the natural refrigerants. And then there is a camp that says the problem is not the refrigerant, the problem is the leaks. So no matter how harmful the refrigerant is, if it does not leak into the atmosphere, it's not causing any harm to the environment. So you have those two camps. And when I started out working at the EPA and founded the Green Shield Partnership, I believed equally in both of those, and I still to a certain extent do. However, the conclusion I came to after many years in this industry is that there is no such thing as a refrigeration system or a piece of refrigeration equipment that does not leak. It always leaks. So the people who manufacture these high GWP HFCs and sell them are big fans of this second theory, where they say we should focus on the leak. And that is always good advice. So we are going to talk a little bit about that. So when you're talking about leaks, unfortunately, all of the regulations and almost all of the practices and all of the technology available out there focuses on repairing leaks. However, just philosophically, if you have an entire program that is focused on repairing, you will never actually get down to zero leaks. Right? You will always harm the environment, because in order for your program to go into effect, you have to first leak in order to be able to repair that leak. I recommend a program that is focused much more on preventing leaks. And if not preventing leaks, then what you have to do is you have to have tools and technology in place that discovers the leaks that are happening as fast as possible and get them repaired as fast as possible. So for the first time really in the history of refrigeration, we have really good choices out there, whether you're talking about refrigerants or the technology solutions. The history of refrigeration, ever since we discovered the ozone hole in the well, it became the Clean Air Act went into effect, Title VI, in the early 90s. It's actually been a series of moves from one really horrible refrigerants, the freons, always to choices that were just a little less bad. And up until recently, now that we have the natural refrigerants, we finally actually have choices that are good rather than just a little bit less bad. And really now we have technology solutions for the first time that do as good of a job, I think, as is possible at preventing leaks. Some of them are more expensive and more ideal for larger supermarkets, but there are actually great solutions for small stores. And they are especially ideal for companies that don't have refrigeration specialists on staff. So in a lot of the smaller companies, they even if they have 10 stores or 30 stores, that's usually not enough for them to employ a full-time refrigeration specialist who sits there and thinks about strategies to prevent leaks. They will just rely on their service contractors. And there are good service contractors out there, but let's face it, the more that your refrigeration equipment leaks, the more money your service contractor makes. So he is not necessarily giving advice to these small companies to prevent leaks, because by doing so, he'd be putting himself out of business. So that's where you guys come in, and we want to make sure that we talk to you just a little bit about the solutions that are available. We won't go into a lot of detail, but we will give you a list of resources that you can forward on to your clients out there, as to give them some tips about where they can find some more help. So next slide, please. Okay, next slide. So here are some of those resources. So basically, there are, the story here about who to get help from is as much about who not to get help from. So the vast majority of people who are offering help all over the place are actually people who are trying to sell something to the end users. So the chemical manufacturers offer training sessions and webinars and in-person meetings all over the country constantly. They have a team of people that are out there for educational purposes. Right? But their educational sessions focus on the HFC refrigerants, and they focus on leak repair, and they focus on basically the products that they are trying to sell you. Service contractors can have a conflict of interest. They are actually, if you have a good one, they are good sources of information, but they are probably not aware of everything that's going on. And they may actually have, or are very likely to have, deals with certain equipment manufacturers that if they sell certain equipment to you as an end user, they earn a certain amount of money. Of course, equipment manufacturers have training centers all over the country, but they train you on their equipment and not on their competitors' equipment. There are lots of people who specialize in, they will say they specialize in commercial refrigeration. There are thousands of energy specialists out there. And they will not focus on the actual global warming potential of the refrigerant. They will focus, if at all, on refrigerants, on the fact that you got to stop leaking refrigerant, because when you leak refrigerant, your energy efficiency goes down. But they do approach it from an energy efficiency point of view. And then there are people out there who focus on industrial refrigeration. They are usually talking about the OSHA regulations. Some law firms out there do have people who specialize in refrigerants, but if you're at the point where you're trying to get help from that law firm, they are probably beyond the type of help that they would be asking you for. There are general compliance companies, and these are the people that mostly focus on industrial refrigeration and OSHA. And they also, they don't actually have any direct experience. What they are doing is they are just taking the text of the regulations and they are reading the text of the regulations to you. The Green Show Partnership is a fantastic resource. They have webinars and fact sheets and best practice guidelines. Any end user can join the Green Show Partnership, but even if you do not join the Green Show Partnership, you have access to all of the resources that are on their website. The Green Show Partnership is part of the EPA Stratospheric Protection Division, and the Stratospheric Protection Division has resources available for people beyond food retail, and just information about refrigerants, their global warming potentials, things like that. So I have my company. I'm the only person out there that focuses on the refrigerant side of things. So complying with Section 608. The majority of my business actually is not about compliance. It's about, strategically, how do you develop, how do you adopt technologies and best practices so that you don't have to worry about Section 608, really is what I like to focus on. But if somebody does need kind of professional help beyond just what they can find on the website, that is what I do for a living. And I had talked about the watch outs. prior to this. So let's move on to the next slide. So we talked about the Green Show best practice guidelines. This is just a list of them, and there is actually even a guide to refrigerant management for small and independent grocers. So the links are directly there on the slide, but if you just Google Green Show leak prevention and repair guideline, it should come right up. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. There we go. There are also just a couple of fact sheets, and for what you guys on the phone here, for what you guys do, if you are going out to visit a small grocer or someone that has been in contact with you, or if you are on the phone with them, these fact sheets can actually be incredibly helpful for you just in conversations with some of the people that you work with out there. So for instance, the fact sheets they're all just one page, front and back. And the maintenance for leak prevention fact sheet will have a bullet point list of different things that people can do. And there's always a little bit more behind that, but at least if you're on the phone talking with someone and they say, well, what can I do to get out of this situation? You can at least talk to them about some of the simple things that are in these fact sheets and have a good conversation with them. They're also good to just carry along with you as handouts if you are actually in a store with a person who's asking for help. Next slide, please. There is a whole host of Green Chill webinars in the archive on the Green Chill website. So there are several updates on the Section 608 regulatory program. There are some very, very fundamental changes to Section 608 that are going into effect as of January 1st, 2019. It's actually a full amendment package that went into effect in 3 phases. Phase 1 went into effect at the beginning of 2017, Phase 2, 2018, and now the last phase of it will be January 1st, 2019. Many of the people that have to comply with Section 608 don't even know that there are changes. There are really anything that you are interested in on this topic, and if you just read the list of the webinar archives, you'll find tons and tons of stuff that you didn't even know you should be interested in. It's an amazing resource. I just recommend that if you go on there, listen to the introduction once. There's always a lengthy process of kind of teaching people how to raise your hand for questions and stuff like that. If you've listened to it once, you don't have to listen to it again. After that, you could just kind of skip the first 10 minutes of the webinar. Especially on the recent ones, it seems like the logistics of the webinar software take up the majority of the time. Just breeze through that and get to the substance of it. Next slide, please. So that was all that I had prepared. You could talk an hour about each one of the slides that I put up there. What I do want to say is that the issue of the technology that is available out there, and when I talk about that there is especially technology available for small stores that can almost prevent all leaks. I mentioned that. I'm happy to go into that more, but it would probably take up the entire time of the webinar. But anybody who is interested in that, if you are, just post a question there, and I can talk about that if we have some time. And otherwise, that might be a topic for a follow-up webinar here, because to me it is the most fascinating part of this. But I'll hand over to Ben now, because I had the pleasure of facilitating a workshop in Boise, Idaho. He and I both live in the great city of Boise, so we held a workshop here, and he's going to talk about that. So go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Keely. And yeah, you're right. We both live in currently hot and smoky, oppressively hot and smoky Boise. But yeah, so we did hold a workshop on refrigerants, and I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. But I just wanted to give everyone on the call just a little bit of a background and some context for how we kind of came to put this workshop on. Back in 2016, I'd been looking into the impact of refrigerants. We'd actually completed an audit. I worked with some interns at Boise State and their facilities, buildings, and maintenance folks to audit the refrigeration leaks coming from the HVAC systems throughout the entire university. And the conclusion from that was that the climate impact from those leaks was greater than the climate benefits that the university was going to get from swapping out all of their fluorescent and incandescent light bulbs to LEDs, which they're currently in the process of doing. And this wasn't even like they didn't even really have like, astronomically high rate of leakage. I mean, we're talking something on the order of like 4 to 5%. But it was mostly, R410A and R134A, and it's just the impact, the magnitude of the impact is significant coming from those refrigerants. And when you look about it, there's a caveat here too, is that the impact from the HVAC refrigerants. You might have seen that pie chart earlier, which showed that the impact from HVAC refrigerants is takes up a larger chunk of things. That's considerably more diffuse than what you get from grocery stores. The impact is considerably more concentrated in grocery stores because that chilling equipment is running 24/7 versus the HVAC equipment, cooling systems are running for, a few months during the year. It's pretty much here anyway. It's going to be running from like May through September. So for a lot of the year, that stuff is not in use. It's just not getting the same level of use that what you see at the supermarket. So that work was interesting and revealing to us, and so we actually spun that into a couple of audits at local grocery stores and food cooperatives, and those two produced interesting results for us. I mean, it was a pretty limited study. We looked at 3 stores. The leakage rates at 2 of those stores were pretty low. They were new stores. They had new equipment. Their leakage rate was, less than 3%, but the equipment was not even 2 years old yet. But we also looked at, I'd almost call it a clandestine food cooperative that was using borrowed and very inexpensively purchased equipment, some of which was still using R22. And the leakage rates from that was considerably higher than national averages for, similarly affected stores. I mean, we're talking, over 20% a year. That's from what we could actually, reasonably document. So that was pretty revealing. So we had we were able to develop a working knowledge of the impacts of these refrigerants on climate change and some insight into what things are actually looking like on the ground here locally. And based on our discussions with Boise State and these grocery stores, we found that there was a general awareness about the phase out of CFCs, but not really any kind of awareness whatsoever on the climate impact of the HFC refrigerants. And so to that end, we really wanted to develop an outreach model that would raise awareness about the impact of those refrigerants and then also address the barriers to adoption of low global warming potential refrigeration options, which are pretty much those natural refrigeration options. And so to accomplish those goals, we worked with Keeley and Morgan to develop a workshop centered around information addressing those megatrends that Keeley was talking about, the discussion about states looking to, phase out the use of HFC refrigerants and what's going on, globally and nationally. And then also addressing the barriers to adopting new refrigeration technology. And so our principal target audience was supermarket retailers. We tried to convince convenience stores to attend because that's also a really large sector that would be impacted by this, but we were unsuccessful to that end. I'm not sure what the picture's like in some of your other states, but at least in southern Idaho anyway, the convenience store market is pretty much dominated by 3 companies. It's Stinker, Jackson's, and Maverick, so that they probably make up a good 80% of the market here. And so I think there's a significant opportunity to engage these folks in the future, but at least a couple months ago, we were unable to do so, unfortunately. But yeah, I really have to give all of the credit for this to Morgan and Keeley for pulling this together. Tapping into their network was pretty much essential to making this workshop successful. Not only to get the attendance that we did, but to deliver the content that we were able to deliver. So we were fortunate to have locally headquartered companies, Albertsons, Winco, Idaho Power attend as well as Boise State's engineering department, faculty and students from there. But we also had other end users, Costco, Target, Sprouts, Whole Foods, and then the remainder of the participants and then some of the presenters were composed of design and engineering firms and equipment manufacturers. And so the essence of that workshop centered around Keeley discussing those mega trends, which we talked about here, where we're going from a regulatory standpoint, the impacts of the HFC refrigerants on climate, and then presentations from design and engineering and manufacturing firms on equipment alternatives and the natural refrigeration options. So like ammonia booster systems, CO2 transcritical systems, self-contained propane units, and the advantages and disadvantages thereof. You see the agenda that's posted here, give you kind of an idea of who was presenting and what they were presenting on. And what really came out of this was a really useful and candid discussion about the challenges and benefits of these natural refrigeration options. So we talked at length about some of the challenges that were posed by these systems, including like what was discussed earlier about getting qualified service techs to come out. One of the things that I was unaware of is apparently there's a lot of crossover between service techs working in HVAC versus service techs that are working in refrigeration. And I guess if you're a service tech, you really want to go HVAC because you can work like a 9 to 5. But if you're working in refrigeration and all of a sudden, a store's ice cream container like is malfunctioning, in the middle of the night, and they got $1,000 worth of ice cream in there, then you have to go and service that, in the middle of the night kind of thing. And so that was an interesting, discussions like that, right? The questions that are raised during these presentations that were really revealing and helpful for all of the attendees that are there. So we talked about, barriers like that. So the service tech barrier, the costs, the advantages, disadvantages of each of these systems, safety measures that you have to put in place, right? Ammonia, you can't use ammonia in like a primary system because it's toxic. You can only use it for a booster system. But if you're using a CO2 system, for instance, if that CO2 like leaks in a confined space, like what are the OSHA occupational safety limits, right? You're using CO2 is being used at higher pressures than some of these things, and so there's different safety considerations. So all of those different challenges and barriers, and fortunately the folks that are in the room, which include end users, were able to talk about like real life, what's actually happening on the ground. Like, so for instance, we had Target that was there and was able to talk about their adoption of self-contained propane unit systems, and that was really interesting and revealing because they were able to talk about, well, here's some of the challenges we face, like for instance going and trying to implement this and getting a sign off from the local fire department, which propane is flammable, and they're necessarily concerned about what are the potential impacts here if we have to fight a fire, right? And you have a flammable substance that you're using in a refrigeration circulation system. So I think one of the attendees mentioned that, the fire department was going to sign off of it off on it if they could show where the pilot light was, which was interesting. So needless to say, this is not a pilot light in that propane refrigeration system. So anyway, we were able to see like real case studies and hear from end users who are actually using this equipment. You're able to hear from all of these competing manufacturers of this equipment about the advantages and disadvantages of this. Keeley mentioned be wary of somebody who's trying to sell you something. Well, the fortunate thing is when you get all these guys in a room that are all selling competing equipment, right? Everything, all the cards are on the table, right? And so they have to be. I guess I don't know. I'd like to say it keeps them honest. Anyway, so that was really useful. But anyway, I thought it was a really, really successful workshop. We had about 60 people attend that. We hosted at our Associated General Contractors building, so it was offsite. It was a neutral location. It worked really well for us, and overall, we were just really, really happy with how it turned out.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you to our other wonderful speakers. This has been very enlightening. So I wanted everybody to, again, thank you for attending. And here is contact information for all of us. And if you're at all interested in hosting a workshop similar to what Ben and Keely and Morgan did, probably I would just suggest contacting Morgan and Ben to start off with. Further questions for me, Michelle, is anything to do with slides. If you'd like a copy of the slides, you can email me. We have recorded this webinar, so we will eventually get that link posted and send it out to all the attendees. We have one question so far, and that is a question about whether EPA or others might have funding to support stores for moving to either natural refrigerants or improving their maintenance and leak detection and leak repair.
So I think I might be able to answer that best. I used to get this question quite a lot when I ran the Green Chill Partnership at the EPA. Yeah, after listing out all of the different options that are available to help in this area, of course, the question that came up immediately was, well, does the EPA provide funding? And I think you'll find that any regulatory agency in any area doesn't provide funding for things that are required to happen under the regulations. When you start talking about going beyond that, I actually had to train myself not to spontaneously laugh when I got that question, because we were always actually struggling for the funds to just keep the Green Chill Partnership going. And we had a budget of about, it ranged from $25,000 to $40,000 a year for the whole nation. So no, the EPA in general does not have any funding at the within the Stratospheric Protection Division. Sometimes, every once in a while, the pollution prevention departments of the EPA regions have some money to give out. And I'm not real sure how that works. It was always a little bit baffling to me. Every once in a while, somebody would call me and say, hey, we have a little bit of money. Do you have any ideas? It's never really enough, though, to make a significant difference. What I can say is that for anyone that does ask you that question, it has been proven over and over and over again that investing in these technologies especially, but also in best practices, results in financial savings. So it is a very, very good investment. There is a company in rural Pennsylvania called Wise Markets. They made it a priority to invest in reducing their leak rates, and they wound up having so much extra money from doing that. They wound up cutting their leak rate in half, that they actually started out giving bonus payments to their in-house service contractors for their accomplishments. They wound up just, normally the refrigeration department of any supermarket, it's just a cost center. And they actually wound up having such a return on their investment that they started being able to shift money from their budget to other budgets within the company. So it is one of the few environmental areas where I think that pays off as well as this does. So if you do get that question, I would focus people's attention on that aspect of it. There are some things that can be done very, very cheaply. For instance, establishing a program where a service technician comes in and just walks through the entire store once a month with a handheld leak detector. That costs about $150 to $200. In fact, the service technician should have it or must have it already. But having him come in and just walk through the store with a leak detector can really reduce your leak rate very significantly. So it's not all incredibly expensive.
I wonder, with the global warming potential, having such an impact, if for nonprofits, if there's an opportunity to propose grants to have them help cover some of that kind of stuff. Anyway, I have another question for Morgan. Can you provide a little deeper explanation of the challenges of using natural refrigerants? And then I do have one other question after that, and we do want to end right at noon. So, Morgan.
Yes. Well, I will give that could be a very long answer, so I will give a high-level one, and then whoever asked the question can follow up with me offline after. But the primary barriers, sort of what we are focusing on first and foremost, are those three that I outlined. So the high upfront costs, service readiness, and codes and standards. The reason that we're focusing on those is because though there are other issues, we think that by addressing those, they start to kind of have a ripple effect with some of the other challenges. And a very quick overview of those three and kind of what we're referring to there is with costs, there's the natural refrigerant systems and equipment haven't quite reached economies of scale yet because the adoption rate is pretty low. So that means that the equipment itself is pretty expensive. Other things that are influencing costs, as I mentioned, often the service technicians, you may pay a premium for service if your service technician needs to be trained in a new area. And you also, a lot of end users end up storing natural refrigerants on site because distributors often don't carry natural refrigerants, and so they have to rent canisters and find a place to store them safely, and that can really increase the cost. We see this a lot with CO2. And then for the service readiness, that obviously ties in with cost, but other challenges that are contributing to that are there's a decline in the workforce of service technicians in general. So we're looking at a smaller workforce. And then within that workforce, there's often a sort of chicken or the egg challenge where a service technician doesn't necessarily want to get trained in a natural refrigerant system if they don't have a client that has a natural refrigerant system for them to apply that training. However, we see end users who say that they don't necessarily want to adopt a natural refrigerant system if they can't feel confident that they will have somebody to service that system. Excuse me. So that's one of the reasons why we launched our service network, which is a great tool that I didn't have a chance to mention. So again, if you want to follow up with me offline, I can share the link. It's essentially an Angie's List connecting those folks. And then we're also contributing to training resources to make sure that there's adequate training resources for natural refrigerants. So as Keely mentioned, a lot of the manufacturers are doing really great training programs. However, they're focused on that particular manufacturer's equipment and systems and not comprehensive trainings that kind of cover everybody's equipment and systems. So there's that. And then with codes and standards, those are revised at very, very slow intervals of something like 3 to 7 years, depending on the code and standard you're talking about. And technology is obviously developing at a much faster pace. So we're seeing natural refrigerant technologies come on the market that are ready to be used, but the codes and standards to allow folks to adopt them safely are not being implemented at the same rate. So we're working to try to overcome that and make sure that the safety standards are in place for that. So certainly follow up with me online because there's a lot more we can talk about, but I want to make sure to leave time for that last question.
So here's the last question. Are food trucks and other food vendors included in the regulation? And also, just PPRC was actually wondering if, since we have some friends up in Alaska, if boats, fishing boats that freeze the product on site on the boat itself, if they are subject to this regulation.
The answer is yes and yes. So anybody who uses refrigeration, and refrigeration includes freezers or air conditioners, anybody who uses refrigerants in any function is covered under this. So food trucks, they will most likely have refrigerators. Now, having said that, they're like your home refrigerators. How many times have you had to have your home refrigerator repaired, right? Home refrigerators just don't leak in terms of the types of equipment. So if that's the type of thing that a food truck is using, yes, they would fall under this. They would have to have a pretty large one because the regulations only cover equipment that has more than 50 pounds of refrigerant. So unless it's a very, very large food truck, it probably doesn't have 50 pounds. But that would be the question to ask, is what type of refrigerant they use and how much of it they use. All of the natural refrigerants are exempt from the EPA regulations and from the California regulations. So if they use CO2 or propane or ammonia, none of the regulations apply to them. In terms of the seafood vessels, yes, and they most likely do use more than 50 pounds. Most likely they use the worst refrigerant that is out there, and most likely they have serious compliance issues. Also, the seafood processing industry has been the subject of pretty heavy fines in the past from the EPA. So they most likely do have to worry about this. They most likely don't worry about it, and they should be.
All right. Well, I'm going to call this a wrap. I, again, appreciate everybody attending, really appreciate our speakers, and again, contact me if you would like the slides, and we will send the recording link to everybody as well. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day.